Today, I will tell you the entire history of Japan in one video, simply and in order. From the first fisherman on an empty shore to a huge city with glass skyscrapers. Here they are, these islands at the very edge of the map, 4 large ones and thousands of small ones. They stretch out in the ocean in a long chain and are shaped like the blade of a sword. On one side of the islands lies the endless ocean, on the other, a narrow strip of sea separates them from the vast continent. Remember this strip of water between Japan and the mainland. Soon you'll see how it will save the country more than once. There is very little land here suitable for living. Almost all of Japan is covered by mountains blanketed in dense forest. There are very few flat fields by the sea, so people have always clung to these narrow strips of land and fought for every patch. And the land itself here is restless. It shakes from time to time, making the houses sway. Volcanoes smoke above the islands, and the highest one, with its white snowy cap, is still considered a sacred mountain by the Japanese. And sometimes, a huge wave rises straight out of the sea and wipes entire villages off the shore. Nature here is very beautiful, but it never lets you relax. In the very beginning, life on the islands was simple. People caught fish with nets, gathered fruits in the forest, and shaped clay pots, pressing patterns into the wet clay with an ordinary rope. And then, the first boats arrived from the mainland. People came ashore and poured a handful of rice grains into their palms. It was from this handful of rice that the entire subsequent history began. They flooded a flat field with water and stuck rice seedlings right into the wet mud. Now, for the first time, people had food that could be stored for a long time. In the villages, the granaries filled up with rice, and wherever there is a full granary, there is always someone who guards it and decides how much grain to give to whom. Thus, the first chiefs rose above the common people. The villages were surrounded by ditches and wooden palisades, and they began to fight each other for fields and for water. From these constant fights, one clan gradually rose to the top, the strongest of them all. And the chief of this clan declared something that no one before him had ever said. He pointed to the sun and said that his ancestor was the sun goddess herself. According to ancient legend, the sun goddess sent her grandson down from the heavens so that he would rule over these islands, and it was his descendant who donned the crown and became the very first emperor of Japan. The same legend says that the goddess gave her clan 3 special items: a bronze mirror, a curved sword, and a round jewel for wearing as a pendant. These 3 treasures were passed from one emperor to another as the main symbol of true authority. They are hidden away and almost never shown to anyone even to this day. Even the new emperor only sees them wrapped in cloth. And here is what is truly astonishing: that very same family still sits on the Japanese throne to this day. It is an unbroken line of rulers stretching from ancient legends to the present day. There is no other ruling dynasty in the world as old as this one. The young country looked across the sea at its enormous neighbor. There stood a wealthy, intelligent, and highly developed China, and Japan began eagerly learning from it. Scrolls with Chinese characters were brought across the sea to the islands. At that time, the Japanese did not have their own letters, so they diligently copied Chinese characters with a brush. They also brought back temple blueprints and statues of the new faith, Buddhism. Monks began to erect golden statues on the islands and build wooden temples with beautifully curved roofs. In one city, the Japanese cast a bronze statue of Buddha the size of an entire house. A person standing next to such a statue looked like a tiny ant at its feet. Some of these enormous statues still sit on the islands to this day, but the Japanese never copied anything foreign without reason. They would take any foreign object into their hands, turn it over, study it, and adapt it for themselves until it became truly Japanese. This is what they did with everything that came from across the sea. Here's a simple example. Chinese characters were poorly suited to the Japanese language. So the Japanese invented their own simple symbols for sounds to go along with them. The result was a clever blend of foreign and native elements, found nowhere else. Meanwhile, the imperial court built itself a beautiful capital and began living in luxury. The streets of this city were laid out in neat squares like a chessboard inspired by Chinese cities. At the very center stood the palace, surrounded by temples and gardens. Life at court flowed in ease and beauty. Courtiers wore silk robes, listened to music, admired the moon, and held competitions to see who could compose the most elegant poem. Right there at court, a noble lady picked up a brush and wrote a thick book about love and palace life. Many scholars consider this book to be the very first novel in human history. And it was written by a woman. And the palace amusements were rather strange. Courtiers would smell various incenses and argue over whose fragrance was subtler and more beautiful. They also chose the colors of their clothing so that all 12 layers of fabric would peek out beautifully one from under another. They would spend the whole day on such little things, while in the palace people admired the moon and composed poetry. Far from the capital, in a remote province, a completely different power was growing, rough and well-armed. The noble gentlemen from the capital did not want to wield swords themselves to protect their distant lands and catch bandits. They hired strong warriors. These hired warriors were called samurai. At first, a samurai was just a servant with a sword standing at his lord's gate. But one day, such a warrior looked around the palace, full of poets, and realized a simple truth. Real power does not belong to those who write beautiful poetry, but to those who hold the sword and command the army. And the samurai came for power. The two strongest warrior clans clashed in a great war. The capital was burning and courtiers in silk robes scattered in all directions. The leader who won made a very clever move. He did not touch the emperor or overthrow him. On the contrary, he left the emperor on the throne, with the crown, with honor, and with his sacred title. But all the real power, the entire army, and all the money this leader took for himself and called himself shogun, that is, the supreme military ruler. And here's what came of it. Now Japan suddenly had two rulers. The emperor sits on the throne, people bow to him as a descendant of the gods, but in reality he hardly decides anything. And next to him stands the shogun, who holds the sword, commands the army, and gives all the orders. The emperor simply sits on the throne for honor, while the shogun rules the country. And this will continue for a whole 700 years. Samurai, who were once simple hired servants, became the main social class of the entire country. They developed a strict code of rules. According to these rules, loyalty to one's lord was more valuable to a samurai than his own life, and disgrace was considered worse than death. A samurai wore his katana as if it were his very soul. Such a sword was forged by blacksmiths over many months, folding and hammering the metal again and again, and then it was passed down from father to son. In fact, everything in a samurai's life was predetermined: how to bow properly, how to hold a cup, when to remain silent, and even how to face death with dignity. This is where the famous Japanese calmness and the habit of bringing any task to perfection originated. A dispute between two samurai was often settled like this. They would stand facing each other, place a hand on the hilt of their sword, and freeze without moving. Whoever managed to draw their sword first would be the one to survive. One swift stroke, and the duel was over. And if a samurai lost his honor, he did not run away or hide. He would kneel down and, following his harsh custom, end his own life with a short blade, just so he would not have to live in disgrace. And so, when the samurai were already ruling over the islands, the greatest threat in all of Japan's history loomed from across the sea. At that time, the Mongols were rising on the mainland. Their cavalry hordes had crushed half the world and even conquered vast China. And now, the Mongol Khan pointed his finger at the map directly at the Japanese islands. He assembled a huge fleet and sent it across the sea toward Japan. Thousands of ships packed with warriors filled the entire horizon and moved toward the shore. The samurai came ashore with their swords, ready to fight, but there were too many Mongols, and they fought not by Japanese rules of honor, but with clouds of arrows and exploding projectiles. The Japanese began to be pushed back toward the water, and then suddenly the sky turned black. A monstrous typhoon swept in from the ocean and struck directly at the Mongol fleet, which was anchored near the shore. Huge waves hurled the ships against each other, smashing them to splinters. Thousands of ships, along with their warriors, sank to the bottom. The entire invasion simply drowned in the water. After the first invasion, the Japanese did not sit idly by. They built a long stone wall along the entire shore so that the Mongol cavalry could not roll out onto land. And at night, they would approach the enemy ships in small boats and cut down their foes right on the decks. Years passed and the Mongols came again. This time, the fleet was even larger than before. And again, as if on cue, a terrible storm struck and once more sank almost all the enemy ships. Twice in a row, a storm saved Japan at the very last moment. People fell to their knees right on the shore and said that it was the gods themselves who sent the wind to protect their sacred islands. They called this saving wind kamikaze, which translates as divine wind. Remember this word. It will return at the very end of our story, in its darkest hour, and this time it will save no one. The Mongols were repelled, but unrest began to grow within the country itself. The shogun's power weakened year after year, and one day the entire state cracked and fell apart into pieces. A period began that is known as the era of warring provinces. For more than 100 years, everyone fought against everyone else. There was no single ruler in the country at all. Instead, there were several dozen military lords. Each of them had their own castle, their own samurai, and their own army. And each one dreamed of the same thing, to seize the entire country and become the new ruler. It was during this time that those famous Japanese castles were built, the ones you've probably seen in pictures. Tall, with curved roofs, set atop massive stone foundations. From such a castle, a lord controlled his land and defended it from greedy neighbors. It was also in those years that special people appeared, resembling shadows. They were hired for secret tasks, to sneak into someone else's castle at night, to uncover military plans, or to quietly eliminate an enemy. Such people were called ninja. Later, so many legends would form around them that it would become almost impossible to tell truth from fiction. Right in the midst of these endless wars, an extraordinary ship landed on the Japanese shore. The first Europeans disembarked from it and took out of the hold two things that would shake all of Japan. The first thing they brought was the rifle. A single shot and the sturdy armor of a samurai was pierced right through. Japanese lords immediately learned to make the same rifles and distributed them to their soldiers. The second thing they brought was a new faith and the cross. Missionaries began baptizing the Japanese, and the new faith quickly gained many followers. Remember this cross as well, because soon major events will revolve around it, while the rifle quickly rewrote all the rules of war. Previously, the outcome of a battle was decided by a samurai with a sword. Now the lord lined up ordinary peasants with rifles. The first row would fire, then crouch down to reload their weapons, while the second row fired over the heads of the first. Such a wall of lead mowed down even the very best mounted warriors. A single volley could decide the fate of an entire battle, and out of all this bloody chaos, the strongest gradually began to rise. Japan still remembers three of them to this day. These are the three commanders who, one after another, reunited the shattered country into a single whole. The first was a brilliant and ruthless warrior. He was the first to arm his soldiers with rifles, and began crushing everyone in his path, forcibly uniting the principalities into a single state. He even burned down a huge monastery of militant monks that stood in his way. But he did not have time to finish his work because one of his own commanders betrayed him and drove him into a burning temple. The second commander rose from the very bottom. He was born into a poor peasant family, but through his intelligence and cunning, he rose to become the ruler of all Japan. He almost finished building a unified country so that everyone could see his power. He built himself a gigantic castle with golden decorations on the roof. He also ordered that all peasants be stripped of their swords, so that only his own warriors could fight and start uprisings. Ordinary people were now strictly forbidden to possess swords. The third commander was the most patient of the three. He knew how to wait. He outlasted his rivals, waited for the right moment, and in the decisive battle defeated everyone who still stood in his way. There is even a riddle about these three in Japan. How do you make a silent bird sing? The first would simply kill it for being silent. The second would try to persuade it, while the third would calmly sit nearby and wait until the bird started singing on its own. And in the end, it was the one who knew how to wait who won. This patient commander took the shogun's seat and his family came to rule all of Japan. And this is where one of the strangest twists in all of world history begins. The new rulers looked at the Europeans with their guns and their cross and grew increasingly afraid of them. The outsiders were reaching for Japanese trade, for the faith of ordinary people, and for power. The rulers feared that sooner or later these foreigners would take over the entire country. And so the rulers took a step of unprecedented boldness. They decided to simply lock the entire country up as if with a key. The cross was banned and ruthlessly eradicated. All foreigners were put on ships and sent away. Ordinary Japanese people were forbidden, under threat of death, to leave the islands, and those who had left earlier were barred from returning home. Building large ships capable of sailing far was also strictly forbidden. The doors of the country slammed shut. They left only a tiny crack open near a single port. The Japanese poured an artificial island shaped like a fan into the sea. Only a handful of traders from one European country were allowed there, and nowhere else. Beyond this little island, foreigners were not allowed to go. It was through this narrow crack that Japan peeked at the rest of the world. And Japan was left completely alone behind the wide wall of the sea. In this closed-off state, it lived for more than 250 years. Just imagine this picture. Outside, the world is discovering new continents, sending ships loaded with goods across the oceans and building the first factories. And all this time, Japan quietly sits behind its closed door, like a separate planet. And what's interesting is that these centuries behind closed doors turned out to be surprisingly peaceful. Wars ceased, the country entered a long period of peace, cities grew calmly, shops prospered, and the arts flourished magnificently. It was during this time that puppet and mask theaters appeared, woodblock prints with waves and mountains, and the unhurried tea ceremony. In other words, everything that we now call classical Japan. The capital of those years grew to a whole million inhabitants. Bustling streets, wealthy shops, theaters, and crowds of people. It was one of the largest cities in the world, and all of this was hidden behind a closed door. In the squares, huge wrestlers would meet, pushing each other with bare shoulders and trying to force their opponent out of the ring. This is how sumo was born. And in the workshops, an artist would carve an image onto wood and print it onto paper. The most famous of these prints depicted a mountain and a huge wave with white claw-like foam above fishing boats. Today, the whole world knows this wave. In the theater, an actor with a white-painted face and a brightly decorated robe would freeze on stage in a dramatic pose, eyes bulging, while the entire audience roared with delight. Wealthy townspeople flocked in crowds to such performances. Now, ordinary people enjoyed entertainment just as much as the noble lords did. But for the samurai, in this peaceful world, there was suddenly nothing to do. There was no one left to fight. The fearsome warriors sat down at desks to shuffle papers and receive their salaries in sacks of rice. Meanwhile, merchants rose to prominence. According to the old rules, they were always ranked below all other classes, but now it was their chests that were filling up with gold. A wealthy merchant now lived better than an impoverished samurai. While Japan quietly slumbered behind its closed door, the world outside surged far ahead. There, large factories were already billowing smoke, iron steamships were sailing, and new long-range cannons were thundering. And one day, this new world itself sailed up to Japan's locked door. Huge black ships entered the Japanese bay. They were made of iron, belched smoke from tall funnels, and bristled with cannons. The Japanese rushed to the shore and stood frozen in amazement because they had never seen ships like these in their lives. A foreign officer came ashore from the ship and delivered a brief and harsh ultimatum to the Japanese: open your country to trade, or these cannons will speak. The Japanese had no grounds to argue. They sat down at the table across from the foreign officer and signed a document that opened their ports. They signed it through gritted teeth, on foreign terms. It was a heavy blow. Japan suddenly saw clearly just how terribly it had fallen behind during its peaceful years of slumber. Its best warriors were helpless against these ships like children. And it was at this moment that the character of the islands revealed itself in full force. A heated debate swept across the entire country. Some reached for their swords and demanded that the foreigners be driven out immediately, but others understood the most important thing: these iron ships could not be driven out by the sword. That meant they themselves had to become stronger than them. They had to urgently catch up with the rest of the world and do it as quickly as possible. The old shogunate government, which had brought the country to such humiliation, was overthrown. And then something happened that hadn't occurred in 700 years. The emperor was restored to real, actual power. The young emperor stood at the head of the new Japan, and something incredible began. The entire country rushed to change, not over centuries, but in just a few years. Japan once again eagerly began to learn from others, just as it had once learned from China. Only now, it was learning from the West. Foreign engineers, doctors, officers, and teachers were brought into the country. The Japanese put their best young men on ships and sent them to study abroad. Just yesterday, these young men wore kimonos, but now they stood on the deck in black frock coats and top hats, gazing at foreign cities. They brought home blueprints of machines and entire suitcases full of new knowledge. The first train was a real miracle for the Japanese. People would rush to the tracks and gasp as the iron carriage puffing smoke sped past them without any horses, and in the evenings the first electric lamps lit up in homes instead of paper lanterns. Construction sites sprang up all over the country, new factories began to smoke, rails were laid, and the first trains started running on them. The telegraph was extended, banks, schools, and newspapers opened. A new army was assembled with rifles, and a fleet of steel ships was built using the latest technology. On the parade ground, soldiers in new uniforms marched in straight ranks, just like in Europe. The once closed country was visibly becoming clad in iron and steam. They also recorded the first general law for the entire country, the Constitution. Now Japan had not only the sword and the emperor, but also a set of clear rules on paper, just like the great world powers. And the samurai as a class simply ceased to exist. They were forbidden to carry swords. The proud warriors took off their katanas and became officers, officials, and teachers. An entire world of samurai swords faded into the past in just one generation. Not everyone accepted this. Some of the samurai staged one last desperate rebellion. People in old armor and with swords went out into the open field against a new army with rifles and cannons. The outcome of this battle was clear from the start. The sword lost to the rifle in open combat. Thus, beautifully and bitterly, an entire era of warriors came to an end. The katana was left simply lying in its sheath as a memory of the past. And here is what came out of this whole frantic race. The world could not believe its eyes. In just a few decades, within a single human lifetime, Japan transformed from a backward, closed country into a modern power with factories, a strong army, and a steel navy. And then it began to win wars. First, the Japanese navy defeated its huge old neighbor, China, and then something truly unimaginable happened. Little Japan went to war with one of the largest empires in Europe. A huge enemy fleet sailed halfway around the world to the Japanese shores. The Japanese ships met it right in the strait, flanked it, and in a single battle sent almost the entire fleet to the bottom. For the first time in modern history, an Asian country defeated a great European power. The whole world watched this with their mouths open. Japan was now taken seriously. Just think about how quickly all of this happened. There were still old men alive who as children had seen samurai with swords with their own eyes, while their own grandchildren were already standing on the decks of steel battleships. But this rapid rise also had a dark side. Japan became too confident in its own strength. Moreover, the small islands always lacked enough land and coal of their own. And the military led the country down the path of conquest. The Japanese army stepped onto neighboring lands and began building its own empire, wider and wider. The military's appetite only grew. Troops entered more and more new countries. Japan wanted to rule its entire part of the world, and this path inevitably led it to the largest war in human history. At dawn, planes took off from Japanese aircraft carriers and suddenly struck the fleet of a huge overseas power, hoping to clear their path in one swift blow. At first, Japan seized vast territories, and it seemed that nothing could stop it. But the forces were far too unequal. Against the small islands stood an entire industrial giant, which they could not compete with. Slowly, island by island, the Japanese began to be driven back. The war reached the very shores of Japan. At night, enemy planes droned over the cities, raining fire down below. Wooden houses would burst into flames, entire neighborhoods at a time. People hid in pits, dug in their yards, and listened to the wail of the siren. And then came that very dark hour I warned you about at the very beginning. Over 2 Japanese cities, bombs unlike any seen before, atomic bombs, exploded one after another. Each one wiped an entire city off the face of the earth with a single flash. Tens of thousands of people died in that very instant. For the first time, the world saw nuclear weapons in action, and it saw them used on Japan. Such weapons have never been used in war again. And do you remember that divine wind that twice saved the islands from the Mongols? In this war, that name was given to young pilots who were sent to crash their planes directly into enemy ships at the cost of their own lives. The country once again called for that same saving wind, but this time, the wind never came. There was no salvation, and then Japan did something it had never done in its long history. For the first time ever, the voice of the emperor himself was heard on the radio. He told his people that the war was over and the country was surrendering. People stood right in the middle of the street, their heads bowed to a small radio receiver, and many of them were crying. The proud empire lay in ruins, its cities destroyed, its navy at the bottom of the sea, and its dream of world domination reduced to ashes. It seemed like this was the end. The country was defeated, devastated, and occupied by foreign troops. But it was at this very moment that the most astonishing part of our story began. From these ashes, Japan rose again and soared higher than anyone could have ever expected. The new law of the country explicitly stated that there would never again be any wars of conquest. Never. All the immense strength that had once gone into the military, the Japanese now devoted to peaceful labor and construction. And they repeated their old, proven trick. They began to study eagerly once again, to work day and night, to take the best from around the world and make it even better. Just a couple of decades after total defeat, the poor, devastated country became one of the richest on the entire planet. Japanese cars started driving on roads all over the world. Televisions, cameras, and later game consoles and computers from Japan found their place in every home on Earth. At first, the whole family would gather around a single small television and couldn't take their eyes off the screen. Then, a tiny radio receiver fit right into a pocket, and music became something you could carry with you. Such convenient gadgets were invented and made in Japan, and the whole world bought them up. Where bombs once fell, the Japanese created quiet memorial parks so that no one would ever forget. Across the country, they launched ultra-fast trains, the most punctual in the world, that arrive exactly on time. The world was invited to visit once again. In the Japanese capital, the flame of the great sporting games was lit, and guests from all over the planet sat in the stands. The very country that had recently lain in ruins was now showing everyone its gleaming stadiums and arrow-like trains, while brand new cars rolled off the assembly lines one after another at its factories. And following the technology, Japanese culture spread throughout the world, cartoons and comics in a unique Japanese style, which children everywhere now watch and draw, food that has become loved everywhere, games that the whole planet plays. The country that once shut itself off completely from everyone has now entered every home itself. Only this time it came not with a sword, but in a completely peaceful way. And this is what makes Japan unlike anyone else. Seemingly incompatible things coexist peacefully here. An ancient wooden temple stands calmly in the shadow of a glass skyscraper. A person in a 1,000-year-old ceremonial outfit walks past a super-fast train. Here, the samurai code is carefully remembered, and at the same time, the smartest robots are assembled here. Deep respect for tradition and an eager love for everything new coexist in one country. In the evening, at a huge intersection in the capital, wall-sized screens light up, and crowds from all directions cross the street at once, while just a few steps away in a quiet courtyard stands a small old temple, and someone claps their hands and bows in exactly the same way as people did 1,000 years ago. This is precisely that Japanese approach we noticed together at the very beginning of the story. To take something foreign or old and transform it into something new, their own, and better. This approach has run through their entire history, from Chinese characters to Western factories, from the samurai katana to the modern robot. The history of Japan is the history of islands at the very edge of the world, which could have forever remained a quiet backwater. But instead, they experienced the era of gods and emperors, 700 years of warrior rule, entire centuries behind closed doors, a dizzying rise, a devastating defeat, and a new rebirth. This country was saved by the wind twice and once was nearly destroyed by its own pride. It knew how to slam the door shut to the entire world and how to learn from it faster than anyone else. And through all these centuries, a single thin thread remained, the very family that once pointed to the sun and called themselves kin to the goddess. Emperors on the throne changed, lost and regained power, sometimes living gods, sometimes mere symbols. But this chain was never broken, from ancient legends to the present day. And this perhaps is the most accurate image of all of Japan, to change outwardly beyond recognition, yet deep inside remain true to oneself. Thank you for spending this time with me and watching until the very end. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe. There's still a lot of interesting content ahead. See you next time.